Welcome to this ADCR public presentation. This presentation provides you with a comprehensive overview of the obligations set out in the implementing decisions from the European Commission for the ADCR authorizations. First, we will start with a list of ADCR uses for which final implementing decisions are available. Then, the decisions will be presented article by article, focusing on the technical improvements, control measurements, respiratory protection, and monitoring arrangements. Afterwards, the requirement for feasibility studies will be addressed. Finally, an overview of the information you need to provide if the competent authority asks for a summary of risk management measures, RMMs, and operational conditions, the OCs, will be given. My name is Anne Bierwisch from Phobik, and I will be your host for this presentation. Before we can start, I would like to remind you that this presentation is provided by the ADCR service team. It does not in any way purport to speak on behalf of ADCR or any of its members, nor shall it modify or replace in any way ADCR's or any of ADCR's members' communications with their respective suppliers or any other parties. The information provided does not constitute legal advice. Neither ADCR nor any of its members shall be responsible or liable in any way for any omissions or misunderstandings or for the results obtained from the use of this information. The information is intended to be for general guidance and information purposes only and is relied upon at the user's own risk. No representation or warranties are made with regard to its completeness or accuracy. Neither ADCR nor its members accept any responsibility or liability for loss or damage of any nature whatsoever resulting from the use or reliance on the information. Please note that the compliance with the exposure scenarios, operational conditions, and risk management measures described in the extended safety data sheets is a prerequisite. The authorization conditions described in the implementing decisions are a rigorous cascading of environment, health, and safety risk prevention principles, as well as a continuous improvement principle. The table shows the 11 uses with soluble chromates for which applications for authorization were submitted by the ADCR consortium. All uses have been adopted either on the 28th October 2024 or 20th January 2025 and have been granted authorization for 12 years from the date of submission of each dossier. For your information, dossiers for the non-soluble chromates used in primers have also been submitted to the European Chemicals Agency, the ECHA, but will not be evaluated before next year. This slide shows the obligations from the implementing decision, divided into 3 groups. Those which are already mandatory but require action within 12 months of the date of adoption, those which are already mandatory from previous authorization, and those which can be understood as an extension of existing requirements and require action within 12 months of the date of adoption. The obligations which you already know from previous authorizations and which require that you assess them and take actions within 12 months of the date of adoption are the implementation of technical improvements and the performance of control measurements. Already mandatory are the use of respiratory protective equipment, RPE, and monitoring arrangements including the occupational exposure, biomonitoring, and environmental releases. Also already mandatory are the review and documentation of performed measurements and the substitution plan. Feasibility studies are a new term in the authorization decisions. However, you are already familiar with the process of evaluating and improving the risk management measures and operational conditions in order to reduce occupational exposure to hexavalent chromate. They can therefore be considered as an extension of the existing requirements for technical improvements, but must be implemented within 12 months of the date of adoption. All these measures and Topics listed in this overview are typically common knowledge for the persons responsible for environmental health and safety at your site. In the following slides, I will present the obligations specified in the articles of the implementing decisions. I will begin with the obligations that are already mandatory, but which need to be assessed within 12 months of the date of adoption. We start with the technical improvements which are given in Article 2, Paragraph 2a of the implementing decisions. As you are familiar with the REACH regulation and authorizations, you are aware that the implementation of technical measures to reduce occupational exposure has already been a requirement under the previous authorizations. This is a legal obligation for all authorizations under the Carcinogens, Mutagens, or Reprotoxic Substances Directive, the so-called CMRD, which requires in Article 5 to follow the hierarchy of control principles. In the ADCR implementing decision, it says that necessary technical improvements must be implemented to ensure that exposure to hexavalent chromium is at a level as low as technically and practically possible. The necessary technical improvements which can be implemented need to be determined case by case, as each site has its own work processes and on-site conditions. An interpretation guide on what is meant by an exposure level as low as technically and practically possible will be presented on the next slide. It is recommended that you, as a downstream user, review, validate, and document your actions to ensure compliance with this obligation. Please note that the technical improvements must be implemented within 12 months of the decisions, so by 28 October 2025 or 20 January 2026, based on the adoption date of the implementing decision. For a level as low as technically and practically possible, we provide here our interpretation as a guidance for you. In the European Economic Area, the EEA, exists a binding occupational exposure limit of 5 microgram hexavalent chromium per cubic meter. Some member states, for example Germany and France, have set a lower national occupational exposure limit of 1 microgram per cubic meter, which companies in these states need to comply with and need to demonstrate exposure below this OAL. A limit value above the OAL is rather unlikely, as authorities probably consider 1 microgram per cubic meter to be technically and practically possible. If this approach is taken, then monitoring data should be well below the 1 microgram per cubic meter. However, the final decision lies with the competent authority of the member state, and it is difficult to know what they will consider to be as low as technically and practically possible. In the implementing decisions, it is required that manual handling of solid and liquid hexavalent chromium substances for measuring, weighing, and solution preparation is performed under local exhaust ventilation, LEV, with high containment. The initial authorizations already require the use of LEV, so this obligation is already in place. For the term LEV with high containment, I will give you some guidance and interpretation on the next slide. As a downstream user, you must review and validate this requirement to ensure compliance. The deadline is either 28 October 2025 or 20 January 2026, depending on the date of adoption of the implementing decision. For the technical term high containment, an interpretation guide is provided here to support you making an informed decision. The RUC opinions to the submitted ADCR authorizations contain some suggestions to lower exposure. In these opinions, the implementation of a closed or automated system to perform the dilution of solids, for example in a glove box, and any subsequent refilling of the bath with liquid solutions, for example fixed piping from the containers or mixing tanks to the bath, was recommended. The Advanced Reach Tool ART is a tool recommended by ECHA for regulatory chemical safety assessments and provides some insight into which LEV system may be suitable for which task. In ART, the following installations are described as systems with high retention efficiencies: glove boxes, enclosing hoods such as fume cupboards, and fixed capturing hoods. A glove box is a completely enclosed system where the worker is fully separated from the source of emission. A picture of a glove box is shown left in the bottom right-hand corner. A fume cupboard is shown in the middle of the three pictures. Here, the worker is separated from the source of emission by a screen. When a fixed capturing hood is used, work is carried out in the capture zone of the ventilation system, as shown in the picture on the right. It is also possible to use a combination of enclosures, for example, a fume cupboard in a separate room, to achieve a higher level of containment. Other systems, such as a movable capturing hood, LEV arms, have lower efficiencies assigned to them and might not qualify as a system with high containment. If large quantities of chromates are handled, performing weighing or measuring in a separate room with exhaust ventilation provides a high retention efficiency, as shown in the picture above. For some uses, use-specific conditions such as use of LEV or mechanical ventilation are required for certain tasks. The affected uses are anodizing, chemical conversion coating, and passivation of non-aluminium metallic coatings. In the following slides, these use-specific obligations will be presented. For the use of anodizing, it is required that the specific application of selective anodizing is performed in a dedicated room under LEV. Further, it is required that for machining activities in on-site small work areas, mechanical ventilation is used when it is not introducing a risk. Certain initial authorizations already require the use of mechanical ventilation for machining activities in small work areas, but selective anodizing was not specifically addressed. The term small work areas is not further explained in the implementing decision. In the initial authorizations, work inside wing tanks was given as an example for a small work area. We assume that small work areas such as wing tanks are meant here. Downstream users should validate if LEV and mechanical ventilation are already in place, and if not, take action by the given deadline. As an interpretation guide, please note that for a fixed capturing hood, a high retention efficiency, and for a mobile LEV, a moderate retention efficiency can be considered. For chemical conversion coating, specific tasks such as filling of parts, brushing or swabbing, and pen stick use must be performed in dedicated work areas under LEV. The use of LEV was already a requirement in the initial authorization for brushing and rolling of small to medium-sized areas. Please validate if LEV is already in place, and if not, take action by the given deadline. As mentioned before, please consider the retention efficiencies for fixed capturing hoods and mobile LEVs. For passivation of non-aluminium metallic coatings, it is also required that mechanical ventilation is used for machining activities in on-site small work areas, except where it would introduce a risk. Also for this use, certain initial authorizations already required mechanical ventilation for machining activities in small work areas. Downstream users should validate if mechanical ventilation is already in place, and if not, take action by the given deadline. After implementation of the technical improvements addressed earlier, which relate to all the tasks covered under Article 2, Paragraph 2, downstream users are also obliged to perform control measurements. These shall also be performed within a 12-month period from the adoption date, in order to validate the appropriateness and effectiveness of the RMMs and OCs implemented. If the control measurements show that the taken actions are not sufficient to reduce exposure, further measures shall be implemented to reduce exposure to hexavalent chromium to a level as low as technically and practically possible. As per the initial authorization, downstream users already review the appropriateness and effectiveness of the RMMs and OCs regularly, and take further measures if needed. According to the new implementing decisions, these control measurements shall be performed by the deadline of 28 October 2025 or 20 January 2026, depending on the use. Even if no new measures were implemented, control measurements should be performed to demonstrate that exposure levels are as low as technically and practically possible, and that the RMMs and OCs in place remain effective. We will now proceed to discuss the obligations that are already mandatory. These include the use of RPE and fit tests as well as monitoring arrangements. In Article 2, Paragraph 3a to c, the use of respiratory protective equipment is addressed. As you can see in the summary table, the Paragraph 3a, which covers the manual tasks, and Paragraph 3c, which addresses the provision of RPE, are requirements for all ADCR users. Paragraph 3b covers specific activities and is only included in the implementing decisions for anodized sealing, anodizing, and chemical conversion coating. All of those requirements were already mandatory under the previous authorizations, and I will present you the details of these paragraphs on the next slides. As you are familiar with the REACH authorizations as well as the Occupational Safety and Health OSH regulations at your site, you will know that the use of respiratory protective equipment RPE is a requirement already mandated by the CMRD and/or your national legislation. The main message of paragraph 3a is that you as a downstream user shall ensure that the worker is using RPE while conducting manually performed tasks, such as immersion or bath makeup. The worker shall wear RPE until technical improvements, such as LEV or improved operational conditions, as referred to in paragraph 2, are implemented and exposure data show that hexavalent chromium exposure is at a level as low as technically and practically feasible. The wording of this paragraph differs slightly for the various uses in regard of whether only the technical improvements or technical improvements in combination with LEV or improved OCs is required. A distinction between the obligations applicable for the individual ADCR uses is made by the highlights shown in green and orange. It is the responsibility of the company's own risk assessment to determine, supported by monitoring data, whether the use of respiratory protection is necessary or continued for certain tasks. The paragraph 3b relates to the use of RPE for use-specific activities like brush and swab applications, machining, and selective anodizing. On this slide, the example of chemical conversion coating is presented, but the obligations are very similar for the uses anodized sealing and anodizing. Similar to what was shown on the previous slide, the use of RPE is required for use-specific activities until technical improvements are implemented and exposure data show that hexavalent chromate exposure is at a level as low as technically and practically possible. This requirement is also mandated under the CMRD, and it is up to the company's own risk assessment to determine whether the use of respiratory protection is necessary for certain tasks. The provision of RPE to relevant workers is addressed in paragraph 3c. A downstream user shall ensure that the workers are provided with adequate RPE that has undergone a fit test prior to its first use, and that the workers perform a fit check of the seal of the RPE before they start a relevant task. Further, it is required that the downstream users ensure that workers are adequately supported and trained to perform these fit checks. This obligation should not be new to you, as the initial authorizations already required fit tests for RPE. An addition stated in the decisions is the fit check of the seal. For both procedures, I will provide some additional explanation on the next slide. The fit test of RPE has to be done once before a new mask RPE device is used. It measures how well a RPE device fits and seals to an individual wearer's face. Possible tests are the qualitative or quantitative fit test. For further information, please refer to the guidance on the RPE fit testing provided in the HSE Fit Testing Basics in the INDG 479. The link is provided on the slide. Please be aware that a repeat of the fit test is required if any changes to a person's face occur, for example, weight loss or gain, dental work, and scars. The fit check of seal has to be performed by the workers each time the RPE device is put on. It is a quick check for correct fit and seal, so to adequately protect the worker. The fit check should be performed according to the RPE manufacturer's instructions, and these tests can be a positive or a negative pressure check. Further, downstream users must ensure that the workers are adequately trained and supported to perform both fit checks. In most guidance documents, an annual training and documentation of the training is recommended. If you would like to learn more about the fit checks, please consult the information provided on the slides as links or get in contact with your RPE manufacturer or OSH team. Although the control measurements are described as a separate condition in the implementing decisions, downstream users are already required from the initial authorizations to perform monitoring programs. This slide provides an overview of the already existing monitoring requirements for occupational exposure, biomonitoring, and environmental releases. I will go through them one by one in the next slides. Please note that the sequence of articles for biomonitoring and environmental releases differs for electroplating. Again, as you are aware from the initial authorizations, there is a requirement for annual air monitoring programs for occupational exposure. This shall be continued under the ADCR authorisations. Be aware that you must use an appropriate standard methodology for these measurements you carry out. You can take personal or static samples, but the measurement must be representative of all tasks, including maintenance. In comparison to the initial authorizations, there is no need to report the occupational monitoring data to ECHA anymore. Biomonitoring was not a requirement in the initial authorizations. However, many sites already perform it to assess the occupational exposure of their workers to hexavalent chromium. In some member states, it is also required by the authorities. Under the ADCR authorisations, downstream users that already have a biomonitoring program in place shall continue with it. A frequency is not specified. This slide summarizes as a reminder the review measurements which are already required from the initial authorisations. From the information gathered from the occupational monitoring program, downstream users are obliged to review at least annually the appropriateness and effectiveness of the RMMs and OCs in place. Further, downstream users shall review the assessment of combined exposures for different groups of workers. Where necessary, new measures shall be introduced. In addition, you shall document and maintain all the information gathered from the monitoring programs, including biomonitoring and control measurements, and evaluate the outcome of the reviews for any measures taken. This information shall be made available to the competent authority on request. Like before, the annual measurements of environmental releases of hexavalent and chromium to the air and wastewater must be performed at all sites at least annually. The measurements shall be performed using a relevant standard methodology and representative of RMMs and OCs used at the site. There is no need to report the environmental monitoring data to ECHA anymore. Similarly to the review measurements for the occupational monitoring program, you are required to do the same for the environmental release monitoring program. As this was already an obligation in the previous authorization and has been explained in detail for the occupational monitoring program, we will move on to the next slide. Substitution of chromates is mandated under the REACH regulation and CMRD. All granted ADCR authorizations include a substitution plan which shall be pursued. Downstream users shall document any steps taken to substitute chromate substances according to the substitution plan. The documentation shall include any technical difficulties encountered or deviations that may occur. This information shall be made available to the competent authority on request. In the last part of this presentation, I would like to talk about the feasibility studies, which are an extension of the existing requirement for technical improvements and have to be implemented within 12 months. The term feasibility study is new in the implementing decisions. However, you are already familiar with the process as the initial authorizations already require to review and implement additional measures to further reduce the exposure and emissions to hexavalent chromium. Under the ADCR authorizations, you shall carry out feasibility studies for the following 4 measures: the substitution of solid chromates with liquid solutions, or the implementation of closed or automatic systems to dissolve solid chromates and refill bath. The implementation of closed or automatic sampling systems for bath sampling. The installation of systems that continuously control functioning of LEV systems, and the installation of air abatement systems. A generally accepted definition or description for the term feasibility study does not exist. Therefore, it is up to each company to define the scope and details of the study by themselves. The discussion may contain, among others, arguments on economic and feasibility, adequacy, balancing efforts, for example costs and workforce, versus the expected benefit, for example the reduced exposure. It may also include timelines or face difficulties. We recommend to you to write down justification when measures cannot be implemented, it seems to be apparent that sites do not have to perform a feasibility study for measures already implemented. The deadline for the feasibility studies is either 28 October 2025 or 20 January 2026. In case you need more practical guidance on whether a feasibility study has to be conducted for a certain measure, please consult the ADCR website under Granted ADCR Authorisations for the guidance flowcharts for determining if feasibility studies are required, which will lead you through a decision tree. In the presentation How to Execute at a Site, which can be found on the ADCR website under Webinar Series, we will explain in detail how to use the flowcharts and come to an informed conclusion. This slide provides an overview on the measures for which feasibility studies shall be performed. As you can see, most measures are relevant for all ADCR users. However, there are a few exceptions. So for electroplating and chromate rinsing after phosphating, no feasibility study on the air abatement system is necessary. In case of slurry coating, only the possibility to install a control LEV system needs to be considered. On this slide, I provide some suggestions on what you might consider in the feasibility study for each measure. Please note that these points are given here as guidance for interpretation and are not checklists from the implementing decisions. So for the substitution of solid chromates with liquid solutions or the implementation of closed or automatic systems, you can discuss if you have market access to the liquid solution or not. What effect on the work process or applicability will the use of liquid solution have? For example, you may need a larger storage space as the solution is diluted and comes in intermediate bulk containers, IBCs. Another point to address is effects on the quality of products. Do other risks occur? Handling the diluted solution can lead to spillages or leakage, where then workers are at risk of higher exposure. Also, the workload of the workers may increase as they have to handle higher volumes and need to carry or transport them. Regarding the implementation of a closed or automatic system, you can address the technical feasibility or engineering issues you may encounter if the system is installed. Another point you should also consider are costs. You can get offers and use them to support your argumentation. However, this does not mean you have to ask for offers. For the other measures, also points for consideration are given, as presented on the slides. For the ADCR authorization, you are required to provide the competent authority upon request with a brief summary of the applicable RMMs and OCs described in the Chemical Safety Report, CSR, in an official language of the member state. For this, you may use the extended safety data sheet as a summary source. This was the last obligation I wanted to present to you that you need to consider for compliance with the implementing decisions. For more practical guidance on how to comply with the conditions, see the recording for How to Execute at a Site. There will be an ADCR Q&A session in March 2025 where you can ask questions. The exact time and date of the session will be announced shortly. I hope you found this presentation useful and wish you a good day.